You're listening to CoachingCues podcast, where experts all around the world answer your most burning questions surrounding the wide topic of strength training. Every week we tackle the what, the why, and the how of one specific topic in just 15 minutes. Straight to the point, no fluff. So, without further ado, let's get straight into this week's episode.
What is training volume? What is the role of this variable in muscle hypertrophy and strength gains? Hi there! Before we discuss this topic, let me introduce myself. My name is Witalo and I am a Ph.D. student at the State University of Londrina in Brazil. I consider myself curious and enthusiastic about strength training, so it will be a pleasure to share with you some ideas on this topic. Well, since my master's degree, my main research interest is in adaptations of skeletal muscle in response to strength training. For example, in our laboratory, we have been conducting investigations on optimizing muscular adaptations to manipulate exercise selection, training frequency, and training volume. So, today, I'm going to share with you some ideas about training volume and muscular adaptations. Specifically about the real role of volume on muscle growth and strength gains. I'm going to divide my speech into 4 parts. First, I'm going to define training volume. In the second and third parts, I will discuss about the role of volume on muscle hypertrophy and strength gains. Finally, I will highlight the key points and take-home messages regarding this hot topic in the strength training field. Well, the most accepted form of volume quantification is through the number of sets per muscle group. In scientific studies, researchers frequently quantify this construct through the number of sets per muscle group per session. For instance, 3, 4, or 5 sets for quadriceps when performing knee extension. Another way to refer to volume is the number of sets per muscle group per week. For example, 12, 18, or 44 sets per week for quadriceps. I believe the second way is more useful to us from a practical point of view, so let's use this second approach. So, from the evidence we have accumulated to date, in fact, training volume seems to be one of the main variables, especially concerning muscle mass gains. The source most used to support this idea is the review published in 2017 by Brad Schoenfeld. In this review, the authors proposed dose-response relationship between the number of weekly sets and muscle mass gains, in which 10 or more sets per muscle group produce greater gains in muscle hypertrophy. Since then, this number has been adopted as a general recommendation. So, let's look at the whys and thus be able to identify the extent to which volume plays a role in muscle mass gains. Well, mechanical tension is identified as the determining factor for hypertrophy to occur. That said, it's intuitive to propose that performing a high number of sets will guarantee greater mechanical tension and, consequently, greater muscle growth, right? Not necessarily, because performing high volume will not guarantee high mechanical stress or mechanical tension. Therefore, not necessarily greater volume will maximize muscle hypertrophy. Let me explain why. The benefits of greater volume are related, in part, to the level of effort put into each set. For example, imagine a hypothetical scenario with 2 individuals, Velu and João. Velu performs 15 sets in a week, of which 10 are hard sets, that is, higher effort or 3 or less repetitions in reserve, and the remaining 5 sets are performed with lower effort and away from the momentary concentric failure. On the other hand, João performs only 10 weekly sets, all hard sets. So after 3 months of training, the probability of these two individuals showing similar gains in muscle mass are real. This is because the number of hard sets and, consequently, the number of sets that promote a greater amount of mechanical tension in most muscle fibers was similar between the two subjects. That is 10 hard sets. In other words, sets with higher effort are related to recruitment of large part of the motor units and potentially optimal mechanical tension per set. Because of this, training volume is an important variable to induce muscle growth. Importantly, although the volume is a key variable for manipulating mechanical tension and consequently muscle growth, it is not the only one. This is because the mechanical tension may be manipulated in different ways. For example, by training the muscle at different joint angles, or use exercise with different strength curves, or manipulating the tempo of concentric and eccentric muscle actions, and so on. These are all ways to manipulate the mechanical tension placed on the muscle. In this regard, from a muscle hypertrophy point of view, a better question than what volume should I perform is how can I optimize mechanical tension? In another way, the focus must be on accumulating mechanical tension. So, returning to the role of volume, this variable is one of the ways to increase mechanical tension, as long as each set is performed with a high level of effort. So, someone might ask me, what would be the ideal or upper limit of the number of hard sets to maximize muscle growth? So far, it is not clear what the upper limit on volume would be. And I suspect we won't get this number. This is because the volume scaling seems to be individual, muscle, and exercise dependent. In this sense, I think that more important than getting this rule of thumb about volume scaling is pay attention to the volume progression. We are starting to look at this factor. For example, in a recent study led by Maíra Scarpelli, the authors observed that considering the set volume of previous training and increasing it by 20% was more effective to optimize muscle hypertrophy than accumulating a high volume of sets by itself. That is, without taking into account the previous set volume. In other words, a lifter who previously performed 10 sets in a week and progressed to 12 sets will likely benefit more than simply performing a high volume of sets. Therefore, pay attention to volume progression, as it seems to be the key to promoting optimal gains in muscle mass. What about muscular strength? What is the role of the volume on strength gains? We recently published a review in which we tried to answer this question in light of the recent scientific findings. Well, looking closely at the emerging findings, it is evident that training with higher volume is an effective way to become stronger. However, it is not the only one. We have interesting studies showing similar strength gains with low, moderate, and high volume in different populations. Probably, that's because when you think about increasing strength, the principle of specificity prevails. In other words, lifting heavy weights periodically is the determining factor for becoming strong. Trying to give materiality to what goes through your head, I will use the studies that compared low loads versus high loads as an example. In studies of this nature, research put one group of people to train with, for example, 40% of one repetition maximum, while the other group trained with 70% of the maximum. In some of these studies, the authors underwent both groups to maximum strength tests every 3 or 4 weeks to make load adjustments and meet the overload principle. Well, after 3 months of training, the groups show similar strength gains, even those who trained with low loads. So someone might ask me, what does this have to do with volume? Great question. So if we transfer the logic of the studies about low versus high load to low and high volume studies, it is possible to suggest that performing high load sessions periodically may be sufficient to induce optimal gains in strength without necessarily having to perform a high set volume. In this sense, in our recent review, we argue from the emergent findings that performing high load sessions periodically, for example, every 3 or 4 weeks, may be an alternative way to induce maximum strength gains. Importantly, we need more investigations to describe what is the optimal frequency of high load sessions to optimize strength gains when training with low to moderate set volume. But in practical terms, it seems feasible to increase strength optimally even in periods of low set volume. Finally, as a take-home messages, to get big, be concerned about accumulating an optimal number of hard sets. Something around 10 sets per muscle group per week seems be sufficient. Furthermore, pay attention to the volume progression. 20% increases from the previous 2 weeks training volume seem to be a reasonable progression. These factors will probably maximize muscle mass gains. And what about muscular strength? To become strong, frequently lift heavy weights. For example, every 2 weeks, train with sets of 4 or fewer repetitions, with loads corresponding to 8% or more of 1 repetition maximum. This will likely be enough to increase muscular strength. So that was I had to share with you. Thank you for the listening. Please, if you are interested in exchanging ideas, feel free to contact me. Thank you very much and see you next time.
Thank you for listening to CoachingCues podcast. If you would like your question to be answered by an expert, please head to coachingcues.org/ask. See you next week.